Episode 2, Discovery. Discovery, in this episode, we're going to talk about discovery. We're going to break it up into two areas. One is just the physical act of discovery, and then two, the emotional impact of discovery and what I found out during discovery phase in my particular situation. But before we do that, please visit www.fight-the-4.com. On this site, you'll be able to track my own custody case, which is still happening. There's a trial in May, which I encourage you to look at, as well as there's a spot to donate. My goal with all of this is not only to communicate and express the emotional impacts of the 4% when you go to a custody case that goes to trial, but to also help others and help. This is a daunting task, especially since mine's been going on for 5 years. The financial impacts on this are crazy, and that's part of some of the techniques that opposing counsels will use as well. So once again, please visit www.fight-the-4 and follow along. And always, you can catch these episodes on Apple and subscribe. Discovery, episode 2, Discovery. Okay, so first we're going to break this into two areas. The first area is just the physical act of discovery and how daunting it can be. The so in the state that I live in, you have to be in North Carolina, you have to be separated for a year before you can file for divorce, right? Which is, as I told you before about the conundrum, which is, you never want to leave the house, but yet in order to get divorced, you have to leave the house, which is, I've read about some unique situations where couples will have, one will stay in a different part of the property and whatever it may be, but it has to be two different mailing addresses. So I never understood that. But in this particular case, everyone says, Did you leave the house?" They ask you, opposing counsel and my own counsel asked me, "Did you leave the house?" And of course you have to, and I did. And then they said, "Oh, you shouldn't have done that." Well, I mean, what do you do here, right? Like, where's the win? I mean, but that's not what we're going to talk about for discovery. What we're going to talk about is, in this situation, opposing counsel asked for not only that, the time frame that I've been out of the house, but also 4 years back. So everything from 4 years back, right? Credit card statements, bank statements. I think they were even looking at health records at some point, and all of these. It's very they ask for a lot of information. It can be very overwhelming, right? In this situation, one of the you can either if you're really well organized and you have all this information available, you can send it over, or what you do is you send it to your own attorney. Your attorney puts it on a shared drive somewhere, and then you and your attorney and the opposing counsel have access to it. Or you can just have your attorney subpoena all of the financial firms or whatever it is that you have during that phase to send over documents, which, there's plus and minuses to both, right? They're both expensive, but one of them is a lot more time consuming for you to go through and have to, and they can, opposing counsel can come back to you in any moment and say, "Well, we want more of this," or there, what about this, and all these other things. But through a subpoena, subpoenaing like takes that burden off of you, and it just allows the companies to respond directly to them. And it's really up to the company. It's really up to it's up to the company to give your financial. All of the financial places that I do business with were very. They gave out my information. One of them wanted a release, but other than that, I think it was okay. The first time, so I have gone through Discovery twice, and we'll talk about the second time, which is most recent for me, only because as a during the time that my ex and I had departed, I was a contractor working for, and I was an IT contractor, and during that time, I was contracting with a company, and they every year my contract's up, right? Sometimes they do it for 6 months, and sometimes they do it for a year. But every 6 months or a year, they would extend my contract, so that got extended all the way up until about last year, midsummer, and the company was finally like, "We're not going to keep extending your contract anymore because it's expensive, right? Because you have to pay the firm that's contracting you as well as my own money, my own salary. So what they decided to do was offer me a full-time position, which, is great because, you reach a certain point as a contractor where it kind of gets tiring to always keep looking for gigs. And sometimes the pay is up, sometimes the pay is down. It's really dependent upon the market and where we are. But they offered me a full-time gig and I accepted it, which changed my financial situation, right? When you go from a contractor to a full-time employee, you take a little bit of hit in your salary because you get all the other things that you were lacking. I have a really good health plan now. There's retirement and all this stuff, which is awesome and a little bit better for me at this point in my life than being a contractor. So once that happened, opposing counsel like hit the roof, and they started to claim that I took the job just to negate or lower my child support and all of that, which was ridiculous. It's actually better to have a long-term gig that's stable than it is to trying to keep playing the market, which whatever, it's just part of their process. But I had to go through it twice, and both times it's just not fun, and it's expensive because it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time for your own attorney to go over the documents and to keep it all there, and sending it back and forth and all the communications. So it's an expensive process. Now let's talk about the emotional side of discovery. And the first discovery that I went through with my ex, a lot of pieces started to follow. They started to fall into place. W- Specifically, when you have access to all of the your ex's documents as well, right? So they get sent over to you, and you can look at them as well. And what I had discovered was she had been seeing a very high-powered attorney in our area well before we were talking about separation or divorce. So, and it was expensive. And I know this because there's bank statements. So you can see all the charges because they have to produce all of the documents and with your taxes and everything like that. So then things started to click into place for me, which was there was, she was planning. She was planning, and that explains why she was pushing so hard for me to get therapy, why she wanted to attend all the therapy sessions, why she spoke so much during those therapy sessions. You know, I was always I always struggled with, well, if this is going to be, therapy, then I should, I should work on myself. And sometimes not having the other person there, as much as they may or may not, it's an influence, right? You have a bit of a wall up if there's somebody there with you because you're not communicating as honest maybe as you should be because you have this person, and maybe the things you say would be, hurt the other person. So you don't want to say it in front of them. And once again, this was one of the greatest things that I learned going through all of this, which was, I lost my sense of self during that. So I was very easily manipulated and influenced by my ex in these sessions because I thought whatever problem it was, it had to be me. Why else were we so miserable? And why else were we so just not communicating and fighting and all these things? So of course I had to be me, right? Like, yes. It wasn't 50-50, right? Let's be clear. It was a 50-50. I enabled it. I let it happen, so I'm just as guilty. But I realized during discovery exactly what it was that she was doing, and she had intended all of this. She had set all these little traps that I walked into, and now they were going to be used against me in court. And we'll talk about that on the next session, which I believe is the TPA, which is the temporary parental agreement. And that was my first time going to court. So I saw all these financial payments to this attorney, and it's my wheels started to everything started to kind of go into motion on this one, which explains why there was such a battle with communication with the kids, why everything had to be done on her terms. And it really confused me, and it was really hard for me to admit and to see all of that. I felt extremely betrayed. And I felt very naive. Now, you could easily flip this and say, good for her. She planned it, right? Like she's the one who was very proactive in doing all of this. But there's just this part of me that just doesn't sit well with me. Only because if you're a couple, the goal here is to communicate. And if your intention is already get separated and divorce, what's the point of trying to? And we did. We went through couples therapy. We tried it. I think it just it wasn't successful for us because I think we were too far gone at that point. But what would be the point of doing all of that if you ultimately are preparing for the end of the relationship. It seems very half-hearted. Like you never were really genuine in doing this, only because meanwhile, in the back of your head, you're planning your exit. So that took me by surprise. And another thing too was, there's a huge wealth difference between us. She came from a very wealthy family, and I did not. And we had a prenup in place. And for her attorney and to always keep coming at me with more and more documents and threatening to take me to court if I didn't produce these documents, and they were asinine. It was obscene. It was, you bought a pack of gum using a credit card and the charge was 75 cents. Well, where is that credit card and what'd you do with that 75 cents? It was like, okay, come on, like enough. The most important things are your taxes, right? Because you have to declare all of your income on your taxes. So that took a long time. And part of that strategy, I believe, from opposing counsel was financial exhaustion, right? So if you keep doing this long enough, eventually someone's going to run out of money. And I think part of her plan through all of this was to outspend me. And I'll say it worked, right? I mean, this is a brutally expensive situation. To have to keep going back and forth through responding with attorneys is expensive. It adds up. And I think that was part of a lot of the manipulation. And we'll talk about alienation too, because that plays into it as well. There is a strategy here. And that was part of that strategy. That's the way I feel. You know, Once again, you could say, you know what, if you know your relationship's ending, you might as well as plan for it and go see someone. But I think spending over 40, $50,000 to talk to somebody is a little bit too much if you're going to continue to be in the relationship and spend that only to end it, just end it. And it was subtle traps too, right? It was, oh, I want to go to your therapy appointments. Oh, you should talk about this in your therapy appointments. Didn't you say this to me in your therapy appointments? Like, they were private conversations that we would have that she would bring up and ultimately expose during these sessions that I don't think I was ready for. And I wasn't ready for because I didn't know how I was feeling. I wasn't grounded. So during this phase, is when I started to really dig into therapy. I started seeing a therapist. I started going to group sessions. And I joined a men's divorce group in local, which met we met on Zoom because, it was during the pandemic. So all of the in-person gatherings were canceled. So we met on Zoom. It was once or twice a week. It was a good group. It's very helpful, I think, to go to these group settings only because you get to hear other people's stories. Now, knowing that my situation was a little bit more extreme than all of these other people's situations started to help me put a lot more of this together, thinking this is going to be a long battle and I have to be really smart about this. And the first thing I needed to do was really work on myself and discover more about me and why I got here. How did I get here? And I think COVID helped me with that discovery. COVID shut everything down. So I couldn't distract myself with stuff. There's only so much stuff you can watch on Netflix. There's only so much you can do. And it was just me. I had moved out. I was in an apartment and seeing the kids was very random. It wasn't as predictable because we still hadn't come to a TPA yet, and it was always at where we used to live together in the older house. So I would come home to this apartment and it would feel really alone. It felt very isolating, but it also created an environment that I could reflect and start to dig into myself and say, all right, how did I get here? Like, what happened? So I started reading books. I started going to my own personal individual therapy, and I also went into a group therapy setting, all through Zoom, nothing in person during that time. And it was the start. I don't ever think it's done. I think there's always more that comes out, and there's more insight that you learn during this time. But it was a good way to say, okay, get my frustration and all of my anger out and blame because I was looking for blame at that time, but I didn't want to blame myself in that particular moment. But eventually I did, and I couldn't sleep. Sleeping was really bad. My mind kept racing and tossing and turning and thinking about the children, thinking about what this is going to do to them, thinking about me and what I'm going to do. We all had to work remote during that time, so it was in the same house, excuse me, same apartment, just over and over again. And it really provided that stability for me to start to dig into me and figure out what was going on. So discovery lasted a long time, and it's still lasting for me on some levels. I'm still learning things about what happened. I'm still seeing the results of what happened, and I'm still going through it. So discovery is really hard. It's really hard to see, you start to put together what the other person was doing, as well as kind of seeing the mistakes that you made. Once again, I think the next episode we'll talk about how all of this discovery and all these things were used in court. This is be my first court session, right? This is number one. This is where I kind of saw for sure what was happening. And that's when it started to get really bad in terms of the alienation, the forensic evaluations that were coming, and a lot of the manipulation. So stay tuned for episode three, which will be the TPA. As always, please visit www.fight-the-4.com and find out more information and see if you want to donate or just follow along on my own case. All right, talk to you soon.